This morning, we're going to talk about 1ARs, and I'm happy to take questions as I go, or if you want to, I'll try to save some time at the end to ask questions then too. We're going to talk about some top level comments about the 1AR. We're going to talk about 1ARs on each type or category of argument. We're going to talk about what to do when the block feels overwhelming, and we're going to talk about kind of transcending the mediocre or getting 1ARs to that magic place. So some top level thoughts about getting the 1AR. First is that I think the 1AR is super fun. I think it's the most fun speech in debate. It is about getting the debate back on the AF's territory after the block has just had 13 minutes to speak and kind of recontrolling the narrative. And I think that, you should endorse and lean into the fun of the 1AR. The second and probably most important principle about the 2AR or about the 1AR is that it's all about choices. The way to minimize the benefits of the block and maximize the advantages of being affirmative is to make choices. So that means that you have to be strategic in what you are extending and answering. And the way that I think about this is that any argument that you make or argument that you answer must be an argument that you can either win the debate on or that you could lose the debate on. So, any small argument that you cannot imagine playing a role in the judge's RFD should not have a place in the 1AR. It should be all arguments that you can win on or arguments that you can lose on if not answered. You want to extend no more than a few arguments on each flow. So like 2 to 3 arguments on each flow for the off-case positions is kind of your golden number for the 1AR, because that is all part of making choices. And the 2AC, likely said a lot more than that. You are going to choose some of those arguments and just extend those, which enables you to answer block development on those arguments and to advance the debate back into AF territory on those arguments. The third thing about the 1AR is that I think a good 1AR is a combination of truth and terrorism, which is to say a combination of your best arguments, the arguments that will win you the debate, and shiny objects to distract the negative. You have to get good at the truth part of this, at extending and explaining your very best arguments before you kind of get to the stage where you are really throwing bombs in the way of the negative. But hopefully by the end of the selective, you'll be competent at doing both. Last kind of top level thought about the 1AR is that much preparation for the 1AR occurs before the debate. Before the debate happens, you should be doing prep for the 1AR. You want to know what the 2AR wants to go for on each of the core positions against your affirmative, and you want to write 1AR blocks for those arguments. So have conversations with the 2A about every single negative position that exists against your affirmative, know what 2AR they want to give, and then write 1AR blocks on the particular arguments that the 2AR wants. And the structure of those blocks, we'll talk about what this means in a couple minutes, but they should follow the EAIR structure, EAIR. Did not spell structure correctly. And they should include cards. I am a fan of including your best piece of evidence or a couple of cards in the 1AR because it lulls the negative into a false sense of security. If you've read a card in the 2AC that's like pretty good, it gets the job done, it makes a good argument. The block is like, okay, this card is good, but it's not like amazing. They're going along, they're super happy. Then the 1AR drops the hammer and reads 2 more cards that are much better. That puts the negative in a really tough spot for figuring out what they're going to, go for and win on. So think about and talk with your 2A about getting your best arguments and your best evidence into the 1AR. Some mechanics about the 1AR before we talk about kind of different types of arguments. Prep time. So the golden rule that I tell people for the 1AR is that you should use no more than half of the prep time that you have remaining. So if the 2AC took 2 minutes and you have 6 minutes left, the 1AR gets 3. The 2AC, maybe took a long time, took 5 minutes, you only have 3 minutes left, you get 1.5 minutes. You have to leave half of the remaining prep time for the 2AR in order to give them a shot of really, giving a good 2AR. And so this is is difficult for a lot of people because I see a lot of high school 1As take like 5 minutes or more, which should never be the case. So how do you do this? Well, much preparation, as we just discussed, for the 1AR should be done in advance of the debate. If you have written 1AR blocks, it suddenly becomes a lot easier to give the 1AR without a lot of prep time. Second, most of the rest of your prep should be occurring during the debate, but before actual prep time for the 1AR begins. So for example, the prep time for the 2NC, as the negative block is preparing to go, that is prep time for the 1AR. You should be writing out your extensions and explanations of your critical arguments. Anywhere that you don't have a block already written, you should be writing blocks then. Anywhere that you do have blocks written, you should start to fill them in with details from the negative evidence and the negative particular explanations. Because you have the 1NC, you know some of where the debate is going. You can start to write out your more complete explanations of your arguments in the context of the negative arguments. Next, the best prep for the 1AR is the 3 free minutes that you get in cross-ex of the 2NC. So the 2NC happens, the cross-ex of the 2NC happens. Under no circumstances should the 1A participate in the cross-ex of the 2NC. There's no need for it. If you have a burning question, communicate with the 2A and they can ask it, but you should mostly be prepping. And I do not think that it is important for you to be pay rapt attention to this cross-ex, because I think you should be prepping for the 1AR. If something important happens that you need to deal with in the 1AR or allude to, the 2A should communicate that to you. So cross-ex of the 2NC is 3 free minutes of prep time for the 1AR that you should be using. Next, while the block is occurring, so during the 2NC and the 1AR, you should be preparing for the 1AR. You obviously have to be flowing, but you should get in the practice of shadow flowing. Does anyone know what I mean when I say shadow flowing? Tebow.
It's like instead of writing what they're saying, you're writing the answers to what they're saying.
Good, exactly. So you're writing your responses to what the negative is saying rather than writing down exactly what the negative argument is. You're writing your responses. So practice shadow flowing, and all of a sudden your 1AR will be mostly done by the time the block is over, because instead of writing down every little thing that the block has said, you have written down your answers. And then last, anytime that the block is answering an argument that you know you're not extending, that is more free prep time that you can be working on the 1AR. And that you still obviously have to keep an ear open while this is happening. You can't just be like zoning them out and ignoring them, because you have to know if there are arguments that you need to answer. But you know, the 2AC always makes a state's counterplane theory argument and you never extend it. That's free prep time while they're answering that. Any argument that you know you're not going for while the block is answering it, that is prep time for the 1AR. Order of arguments in the 1AR, this is really important. So the kind of classic formulation for AF speeches is that you go in the order of case, and then T, and then counterplans or diseds, or counterplans or critiques, and then diseds. And I think that order is totally fine and a good basic structure to follow. However, I think that in the 1AR, it is valuable for you to potentially mess with that order, because you should be assessing relative threats. Assess relative threats in the block. Not every strategy in the block produces an equal likelihood of a negative win if they go for it in the 2NR. This is just kind of a fact of debate, that the block is going to extend some things that are not going to produce likely wins if they go for it in the 2NR, right? And so the least threatening arguments that are in the block should be at the bottom of the 1AR. The most threatening arguments should be high in the order, and you should go in descending order of threat. This sometimes could mean, you know, putting a T argument lower in your order. And I know that sounds very scary. And I would say not to necessarily do this until you've mastered the basics and the kind of mechanics of a good 1AR. But, you know, there are times when the block shadow extends T and they just kind of like repeat the standards and assert that their interpretation is better. And, you know, it's like a 2-minute extension, and they're just not, it's very obvious that they're not going to go for it. If that is the case, you know that if the 2NR is T, it is not the likelihood of a win is very low. And so your order should account for that, and you should, deprioritize it in the 1AR. And the reason, a lot of times people are like, okay, I know that this T argument or this disset or whatever is not very threatening, but I'm gonna blow through it. I'm gonna get through it really fast. So I'm gonna put it high up in the order. That never works out. Everyone is more top heavy than they think they are. And that's particularly true when an argument is bad. You are so tempted to just like wax poetic about how bad the argument is that you never get to, that you spend way more time on it than you want to, and you don't get to other arguments that are much more threatening. So put the least threatening arguments at the bottom of the order in the 1AR. I promise this will pay dividends because you'll get to it with not very much time, and that's okay because you know that the 2R can't go for it anyway. Okay. 1ARs on each category of argument. So on case. This on case is tricky, and it is where many high school 1As get bogged down. Efficiency on the case in the 1AR is an incredibly valuable skill, and one that I think is worth allocating some time to practice and do drills, efficiency drills on. So practice giving 1ARs where you're answering a set of pretty standard case arguments that are often in the block against your affirmative. Practice getting through them quickly. And the way you want to do this, the way that you want to approach case arguments is what we'll talk about in a second. But the kind of top level principle, you need to assess and recognize whether the status quo is a viable option for the negative. I think there are a lot of high school blocks where the status quo is not viable because the block has missed some core element of the block of the 1AC. They've dropped like an impact or an internal link, or they have, gone for solvency turns that have no uniqueness. A lot of the time, the status quo will not be a viable option for the negative. And that's, I think, particularly true on this topic, where, this adding case is just like a tough slog. It's a battle for the negative to get their DA links and to beat the case. And so when that is true, when you have assessed that the status quo is not a likely 2R or not one that would be a very good 2R if they went for it, that is a signal to you that you need to get through the case fast. I think a pretty similar thing is true for critical affirmatives or planless affirmatives, that a lot of the time I see, a block against a planless or critical affirmative that has kind of like, you should engage the state, and, it's good to engage with institutions, and then like, some vacuous seed the political arguments. And none of these are particularly threatening most of the time. And they don't, gel very well with the off case positions that the negative is reading. So they don't go very well with their T argument, or they don't go very well with their capitalism critique. And so a mistake that I see a lot from critical or planless affirmatives is to spend a lot of time answering arguments that are never going to win the negative debate. So you got to get used to, kind of blowing off arguments or, situations where the status quo is not going to be viable, or the case is not part of a winning 2R, and you got to get used to really blitzing through. So how do you do that? Well, a couple of things. You can consider kicking out of parts of the affirmative. So this is an important strategic consideration for any 1AR. Consider kicking parts of the affirmative. I would particularly consider kicking parts of the AF if there's anything that a counterplan definitely solves, and you don't have answers to that counterplan or a different angle on that counterplan. Any situation in which the negative spent a ton of time on a particular advantage, on defense to a particular advantage, and you have another advantage. So, coverage can be pretty imbalanced where the neg is like loading up on one advantage, but doesn't have much to say to the other one. A good way to get time back is to kick the advantage that there's a lot of arguments against. And so this can be entire advantages, or you can just kick particular parts of the 1AC, particular impacts, particular, internal link arguments. You do not have to go for the entire 1AC or everything that is 2AC extended. Mechanics of the 1AR on case. You want to answer, I know this is very basic, but answer all our block arguments in the order that they were made. So don't kind of like, group 3 different arguments that are in different parts of the flow and then answer them. Go in the order they were made. If you're tempted to group arguments, you should do it by answering the argument the first time it was made and then cross-applying your answers later in the flow when that happens. So don't like group disparate parts of the flow. You should only be grouping arguments when they're sequential or next to each other on the flow. But you can certainly get a lot of mileage out of cross-applying anywhere where your answers are cross-applicable. Next, use embedded clash. So I think that embedded clash is is often overrated, or is something that people think sounds really cool and they want to, do and work into their speeches as much as possible. I think a lot of the time this is overrated, but I think in the 1AR, embedded clash is extremely valuable. So what do I mean when I say embedded clash? It's not dissimilar from the shadow flowing thing that we talked about a couple minutes ago. Anyone know what embedded clash is? Surely you do. Embedded clash refers to, oh yeah, Brady, go ahead.
If the 1NC, or sorry, if the 2NC says no Russia war, instead of saying they say no Russia war, the 1AR would say yes Russia war, and then just give their warrants as to why.
Good. So you're saying the opposite of the negative argument without explicitly saying they say, and then referencing what it was that the argument that you're answering. So stating the precise inverse of the negative argument and then giving your explanation, I think is really valuable in the 1AR because it is highly efficient. And I say this for the 1AR and case in particular, because again, efficiency is the kind of name of the game when it comes to the 1AR on case. So instead of they say X, but, which is like a bunch of wasted syllables, say the opposite of the argument made. So circumvention is unlikely. We solve all causes. Russia war is likely. All of these ways of stating your argument instead of restating the negative argument is a way to save time on the case in the 1AR. You also have to, the same way that you're recognizing relative threats on the off-case positions, be cognizant of relative threats on the case. So a lot of kind of smaller case defensive arguments that are like impact defense or like small internal link takeouts, et cetera, are not necessarily going to be particularly threatening if your 1AC is written well. If your 1AC evidence gets the job done where it defeats all causes, has a strong internal link, has a strong impact, that explains why impact defense is wrong. All of that will go a long way toward beating kind of smaller defensive arguments. And you should be comfortable kind of blowing through those, restating citing the 1AC evidence, explaining the argument, and then moving on without getting too bogged down, even if they read a bunch of cards, if the argument is not particularly threatening or is not likely to take out the entire affirmative. So, have some willingness to be bold and get through case fast when you can have confidence in your 1AC. And this can be a little bit scary, but it can pay big dividends if you are able to spend more time on the actually threatening arguments that are in the block. Questions about the 1AR on case or any of the stuff we've talked about so far before I move on to off case? Okay, off case positions. So before we talk about particular types of off-case positions, I want to explain the acronym that I put in the chat a little while ago, the E-AIR structure of 1AR arguments. So this is probably pretty obvious, but what do you think the E stands for? Good, extend. So you're extending the 2AC argument. And I would do this, some of this is a 2AC lecture thing, but I would do this by number. So 2AC number 1, 2AC number 3, 2AC number 5. Extend the 2AC argument. So E equals extend the 2AC argument, complete with explanation or warrant and the cite from the 2AC card. A, what do we think A stands for? Good. Mariama, answer. A stands for answer the negative arguments or the block explanation. This is so first we're extending the 2AC, we're answering the block. The I is maybe the trickiest part. What do we think the I stands for? Indict is good. I think that's part of answering the negative argument though. So you're indicting negative evidence as you're answering it. Advite, good. Implicate or impact the argument. What does it mean if you win that argument? Why does it take out the rest of the flow or mean that you should win the debate? And then R, what do we think R stands for? Good. Read more cards. And you won't obviously necessarily read cards on every single argument that you're extending in the 1AR, and we'll talk about where cards are more and less useful. But your basic structure for 1AR arguments off case should follow EAIR. So, topicality. We meet arguments. I would only extend we meet arguments if they are true or if they are something that the negative has really botched. You need to actually have a plausible reason you meet the violation for this to be a worthwhile investment of 1AR time. If the negative has written their violation correctly, it will be something that the AF doesn't meet. So it will be something that is not particularly useful for you to invest a ton of time in. If they haven't written the violation correctly, or if you have a good angle on we actually meet this violation, if you interpret it this way, then it can be worth 1AR time. But I think that's true kind of a, diminishing, not that often. Maybe more true on this topic as the violations are kind of fabricated. But, case by case basis, kind of a judgment call, but I would not waste, it's like in the schema of you're spending time in the 1AR on arguments you can win or arguments you can lose. We meet often does not fall into either category. Counter interpretation and reasons to prefer. This is the part, this will take up the bulk of the 1AR on a T violation. I would use embedded clash to explain the reasons that your interpretation is superior to the negatives. So, predictability outweighs limits, answers a bunch of their limits argument. Functional limits solve their offense, answers a bunch of other limits arguments. Ground is inevitable, and functional limits deal with it. Kind of find ways of explaining your argument in ways that answer what the negative has said. I also think for this purpose that this is a place that's really good for 1AR blocks, because a lot of the arguments will be fairly standard and predictable from one debate to the next. So T is a place where I would really hone and refine my 1AR blocks to be very efficient and effective. And that you'll find that you don't need to modify them all that much because the things that the negative is going to say are relatively predictable. Make comparative arguments between your offense and the negative's offense. And this is part of the idea. Goes into, you're using embedded clash to compare your argument to the negatives or to say why your interpretation is superior. So always have reasons that, AF ground or predictability or whatever your kind of standard arguments are, that those are more important than, limits, ground, whatever the set of stuff is that the negative has to say. Extending reasonability is a place where I think it's useful to develop some kind of key phrases or signature phrases. So you'll hear these a lot, and it's a good place again to develop 1AR blocks where you're very efficient about explaining reasonability. So good is good enough in a world where the AF can't get offense on T is a popular one that gets at the whole concept of reasonability without having to explain it. Substance crowd out turns their ground arguments. If you're saying that, T incentivizes a race to the bottom to limit out the AF, and that crowds out substance, which you can argue implicates the, educational or other benefits that a negative has cited to their interpretation. I think reading additional cards on T is important in a couple of places or a couple of situations, mostly when, you know the arguments that the 2AR wants to go for. So additional cards, again, if we meet is your whole game and your whole angle against a particular T violation, read additional cards there. If it's the counter interpretation, I would read additional evidence that supports your counter interpretation, and in particular, a card that says something like consensus of the literature is on our side, or here's an expert explaining that our interpretation is superior for whatever reason. So any kind of anything that moves the debate forward and advances the affirmative argument past what has happened in the 2AC. So not just here's another card that says what our interpretation is, but here's why our interpretation is decisively better and comparatively superior to the negative. So move the debate forward on off-case positions. That looks different depending on the argument, but you can kind of figure it out based on what are the things the 2AR wants to go for. Why is your argument better than the negatives? Last thought about T in the 1AR is be on the lookout for arguments you can't drop. And the main one, would be there's a topical version of the affirmative that happens in both plan and planless debates that you'll hear. There's a topical version of the affirmative. I think this is relatively simple to answer a lot of the time, particularly if it's a debate where there is a plan. If there's a topical version of the affirmative, that means that they have to debate this AF inevitably. So the impact arguments for the negative should be inevitable, are not unique offense, because they'll have to debate it anyway, and they should be prepared to debate it. And so topical version, if it's a planless affirmative, you'll probably have a more developed, nuanced explanation of why it doesn't solve your offense. And much of the time, there's only a narrow slice of offense that it could solve anyway. But the main kind of name of the game is not dropping this argument. Questions about the 1AR on T before I move on? Okay, 1AR on counterplans. So I think that most 1ARs on a counterplan should include ideally at least some permutation and some solvency deficit. So a permutation, ideally, you want to extend something that shields the link to the net benefit or makes the net benefit go away, right? So that might be a permutation to do both and an explanation for why that resolves the DA or solves the net benefit. It might be permutation due to the counterplan and an explanation that this is normal means for the plan. This is a place where evidence can be highly useful, particularly if it's perm due to the counterplan, where you are saying that the counterplan fundamentally does not compete. That's a place where you're likely to have to read evidence because the block will have read cards on definitions. And I would make sure to counter define the words that the block has read. But again, you also want to have a controlling argument or a reason that your offense subsumes theirs. Your interpretation of the words of the resolution is superior. And often that will mean getting into the theory debate or some model of competition and an explanation for why your model of competition is better than the negatives. So think about, this is again a place where 1AR blocks are incredibly useful because it can be very difficult in the moment to get down into the, the block read like a 45-second, the 2NC read a 45-second block on perm due to the counterplan. They defined like 5 words, like what am I going to do? Well, if you have your 1AR block that defines the keywords in the resolution that are relevant to that permutation, you'll be in a much better spot in the 1AR because you'll have most of it ready to go. And then the top level of that block should be an explanation for why your model of competition is superior to the negatives and should be preferred. So again, you're advancing the argument past what was said in the 2AC. You're not just repeating like, oh, it's normal means, or it's an example of how the plan could be done. You're actually moving the debate forward and explaining why your way of viewing competition ought to be preferred above the negatives. That, the same kind of principles also apply if it's perm to both and you think it shields the net benefit, like read a card to that effect. This can be tricky for the negative to answer if they don't have a link to the plan, or if the link to the plan is specious and is overcome by inclusion of the counterplan. So some permutations should be in the 1AR. the instances I've just discussed are kind of the, assume that a permutation is one of your core 2AR strategies. If it is not one of your core 2AR strategies, then a permutation becomes more of a shiny object. As we talked about earlier, more of a mine in a field that you're setting for the negative, because you know the negative is going to spend time on the permutation and try and reinsert their 2NC block. You can force 2NR time with a permutation, even if it's not one that you're planning to go for. It's also valuable to have a permutation as just a catch-all, fail-safe for anything that you've missed on the counterplay. If actually, I'm going to come back to that. Solvency deficits is the second thing that I should be in, that have to be in the 1AR against a counterplan the vast majority of the time. They should be tied to specific 1AC advantages, and that should be the advantage that you're extending. Hone in on very specific arguments, specific internal links or impacts. You can quite concisely explain why the counterplane does not solve, and quantify what the solvency deficit looks like, explain why it means that the 1AC scenarios will still occur, and read additional evidence, particularly if the permutation is not your kind of core 2AR strategy. I would read evidence on a solvency deficit if you are planning to beat the counterplan on a solvency deficit. Again, the purpose of reading evidence that is, highly specific, that is tied to a particular 1AC impact or internal link, et cetera, is to advance the debate. It's to say the block has been like, sufficiency framing, whatever. They've like said the counterplane solves, and then they yammered on about it forever. The purpose of the 1AR is to bring things back to the affirmative and say, look, no, you cannot solve this internal link. This is why this matters. Here's why this scenario will still happen. The counterplane is net worse for that, et cetera. You want to make sure that your solvency deficit cards are not just a repetition of what the 2AC said, but are rather advancing the debate forward. A lot of the time, or at least some of the time, you'll find that the counterplan links to the net benefit. And so that is a place that is worth, if true, it's a valuable argument to have in the 1AR, particularly if it's, I think this is true a lot of the time, if politics is the net benefit, that the argument for why it avoids the disad is specious. And this is a place where the 2AC can often make the argument analytically, and the 1AR can read a card. So let's say it's an agent counterplan. They have, the EPA or some agency enact the plan and say, it avoids the politics disad because it doesn't go through Congress. Well, agency actions or court actions is another example, don't necessarily avoid political implications. And so the 2AC can easily say it links to politics if it does this, if the action or the outcome is the same as the plan, then it still creates a political firestorm. And the 1AR can read a card that's like, here's why the agency or court action still links to politics. An important argument to make if you are extending counterplan links to the net benefit is that this is a yes/no question. Counterplan triggers the disad is a up or down, yes or no. It's a threshold issue. It is not a sliding scale. So the block a lot of the time will be like, at least the counterplan links less. The way that you're advancing the debate in the 1AR is to say, this is a threshold issue. There is no such thing as linking more or less. It is a question, if the counterplan sufficiently triggers the link, it means the disad is inevitable. That should be evaluated as a yes or no question, not as a comparative risk, because it doesn't make any sense. Like, links are not sliding scales. Links are yes or no, they happen. If we win a sufficient risk that the counterplane does trigger the disad, then there is no net benefit. Theory, I think this is a very case-by-case basis issue, whether you extend a theory argument. A lot of the time, or some of the time, you will need a theory argument to win. Maybe if it's the state's counterplan and you don't have really good answers, you'll need theory. Other times it can be more of a shiny object, more of something that you include in the 1AR to force 2NR time. So very much a judgment call about whether you're extending a theory argument or not. Another great place to have 1AR blocks that are very efficient, so you can quickly extend the theory argument. And again, the 1AR block should summarize the arguments. They should make comparative reasons that AF offense outweighs neg offense on that theory argument, and then kind of move on. Last kind of category of arguments, offense or add-ons. I think that this is, again, a case of what is your strategy against the counterplan. If you think the counterplan is actively bad in some way, and that is what makes it a bad strategy, then offense is your route to victory. If you have an add-on that you wrote specifically designed for a style of counterplan, like maybe you have a certainty add-on to answer process counterplans, those are times that you want to extend those in the 1AR and have additional evidence for them. But it is certainly not universal that that will be the case, and it'll really depend on the counterplan and your AF strategy against it. Questions about 1AR on counterplans? Okay, critiques. So a lot here depends on the type of affirmative that you're reading and the type of critique that you are debating in articulating or figuring out what is in the 1AR on a critique. Here are some basic principles how that, you know, subsume or transcend those individual case-by-case evaluations. I think the 1AR has to include a reason that the 1AC should be evaluated against the alternative. So many people call this framework. If you're in our lab, you know that Klarman will get really mad and say you should not be extending framework. You should be extending an argument that the 1AC must be evaluated in comparison to the alternative. If you are not, you know, giving the judge a reason that the 1AC matters in comparison to the critique or the alternative, you're going to be in a pretty bad spot. So some argument there that gives the judge reasons to evaluate the 1AC in comparison to the alternative. Second, a permutation. I think that some permutation in the 1AR is valuable on critiques, even if the 2AR is mostly going to be impact turns. The reason for that is that it's a catch-all that kind of shields you against there are link arguments or impact explanations that you don't necessarily have, that catch you off guard or you're not prepared for. Our permutation can be a fail-safe against those things. The second reason is that it is going to make the 2N really mad, and they are going to spend a bunch of time answering a permutation, even if you don't spend very much time on it. So, you know, I'm describing the scenario where your strategy against the critique primarily revolves around impact turns. In that scenario, a permutation is a shiny object. The alternative scenario is that the permutation is your 2AR strategy. And here is where I would spend more time on the permutation and read additional evidence. So you want to think about the reasons that the 1AC and the alternative are compatible with one another, why endorsing the assumptions of the 1AC and the alternative simultaneously is net beneficial or good, and why endorsing the 1AC in addition to the assumption of the alternative is overcomes their link arguments. So those are kind of the three pillars of what you want to accomplish in the 1AR if you're extending a permutation and you want that to be a strategy for the 2AR. So you got to be able to articulate those things. I would all kind of you know, depending on the type of affirmative, people sometimes extend link defense or like no link arguments. I would almost never bother with that in the 1AR. Instead, I would explain any no link arguments through the lens of the permutation, why the permutation overcomes the link arguments that they've made. Because the negative is almost always going to win some link. The easiest way to diminish that link is through a permutation. Third argument in the 1AR against a critique would be alternative answers to the alternative. So ideally, this would be offensive. You want to have offense against the alternative whenever and wherever possible. If not possible, if it's a critique that you aren't as familiar with, you know, or just don't have an offensive angle against the alternative, defense is fine. You know, alternative doesn't solve the case. Alternative doesn't solve the sweeping link arguments that they've made, the big kind of structural impact arguments. They can't overcome those things. I think those arguments are fine as well. But ideally, the offense does the work for you. And this is also a place where I think reading additional evidence is a good idea. In either scenario or either kind of setup, you're reading evidence on the arguments that the 2AR wants to go for. So have an idea what the strategy is against the full range of critiques that you might hear. know what the 2AR wants to go for and read cards on those arguments. I think that critiques are a place where the 1AR often shies away from evidence, and it should be the opposite. You should be ready to read more cards on the 1AR because the block will have read more evidence. You want to advance the debate back to affirmative territory. Final thought about the 1AR and critiques: be on the lookout for K tricks and don't drop them. I'm not going to belabor this point, but you all know that a lot of the way that critiques win debates is just like, oh, the 1AR didn't answer, K turns the case, and like sad face. So be on the lookout for critique tricks. K turns the case, alternative solves the case, root cause, X, Y, Z comes first, you know, ontology, epistemology, scholarship, research, whatever comes first. All the classic tricks you want to make sure that you don't drop. Questions about critique 1ARs? I know I went through that pretty fast. Okay, disad 1ARs. A lot of this will depend on the 2AR strategy again. So what is your angle against this particular disad? I'm not going to spend too much time on this because so much of what a 1AR on a disad looks like should depend on what the 2AR wants to go for, and there is a, you know, not necessarily a one size fits all solution. But I would ideally like to see the 1AR extend some defensive argument and some offensive argument, assuming that you have it. So if you're extending, again, two possible scenarios. One is that the offense is part of your core strategy against the disad, in which case your offense should have additional evidence. The other scenario is that you're mostly going for defense in the 2AR and the offense is a shiny object for the negative, in which case I would not read evidence. I would shadow extend or briefly extend it to force 2NR time, but not read additional cards. If you're extending uniqueness arguments, always read additional evidence. There is like no scenario in which uniqueness is part of your strategy against a disad where the 1AR does not have to read cards. And again, those cards should not just reiterate the kind of core components of the 2AC evidence. I would read additional cards. I don't care if the uniqueness arguments in the 1AR have additional warrants that were not in the 2AC. I think it is really hard for the negative to get away with, oh, these warrants weren't in the 2AC, so you should ignore the 1AR cards. Some people like to think about the 1AR as a 3AC or as a constructive. I think uniqueness evidence or even link turns on disads are a great example of where that is true. It is really hard to get away with this warrant wasn't in the 2AC, so you should reject the argument entirely. And it's really easy for the AF to justify the block made a bunch of additional warrants for their uniqueness and link arguments, so we get new answers to respond to that. So making arguments along those lines should always be part of your 1AR strategy. The big thing, the kind of big thing to be on the lookout for on disads in terms of a can't drop argument are turns the case arguments. This might be link turns the case, it might be impact turns the case. Most of the time there's no impact uniqueness for a turns the case argument, so you can get through those arguments pretty quickly by just kind of saying our advantages impacts are coming now, so there's no uniqueness for the turn. We still solve, this is not a turn. Just to make sure that you don't drop them. Questions about 1AR on distance? Okay, what to do when you feel totally overwhelmed? So sometimes, you know, the block just feels like it's buried you in a bottomless pit. Hopefully the above strategies give you a good starting point for, you know, how to deal with that. You've written blocks. You are not starting from square zero. You have an idea of what the 2AR wants to go for and how to set up the 2AR to be successful. If not, there are some ways of dealing with it. One, you can kick the AF. I would aggressively kick at least parts of the affirmative, maybe the entire thing, and choose some point of offense to really sit down on and hone in on. So maybe it's straight turning politics. Maybe it's impact turning a new impact that was in the block. You should, if you're having trouble in a debate and there is a new impact in the block, there is little reason not to go all out and impact turn it. Because if you are otherwise in trouble, they have just given you an out that you did not otherwise have by introducing a new impact. So think about impact turning or straight turning something that was in the block and aggressively kicking out of other arguments that you've been making. Second, there's theory. Theory is an out you can give yourself. So conditionality is bad, is, the catch-all that, you would have in any scenario that allows you to give the 2AR an exit strategy. Think about theory. I think it's underutilized in high school as a way of getting yourself out of a tricky situation. Third, and really, I probably should have started with this, but new arguments. So we talked about this a little bit, but the way to make new arguments in the 1IR without, without it being a blinking red light, like this is brand new and should be rejected, is to embed it within a 2AC argument of any kind. I do not care what argument, but extend a 2AC argument of any kind, then make the new argument. Say that it is a response to block development. The block is always saying new things. And so you can always get away with this is a response to block development. So hide new arguments on existing arguments in the 2AC and then say that they answer the block. It's sounds a little silly, but will justify stuff that you want to get away with in the 1AR many, many more times than you expect. So those are some principles for what to do when the block, feels overwhelming to you. The last section that I have, or I guess first, any questions about that stuff? The last section that I have, could you repeat what you last said? I think the last thing that I said was that you should hide new 1AR arguments in existing 2AC arguments. And that is a way to deal with, like, the 2AC was totally insufficient on something. The block brought down the hammer and you feel like you're in total trouble. Make new arguments that were not in the 2AC, just hide them as part of existing 2AC arguments, and then say that they respond to block development. Hopefully that covers what this person was asking. Last section, tips for transcending, bringing your 1ARs to the next level. First, pay attention to the pages that the negative kicks. A lot of the time, especially if the 2AC is well constructed, the pages that the 2AR, that the block doesn't go for, have something that can be cross-applied elsewhere. So maybe you've read a link uniqueness argument or an intrinsicness argument that can be cross-applied and they didn't bother answering it because they were kicking that thing. Extend that argument and specifically apply it to something else that was in the block. Maybe they've kicked their critique and you had a capitalism sustainable argument that indicated that, new technology and adaptation is able to resolve a whole bunch of impacts, and that implicates one of the, like, climate change or one of the impacts that they've read elsewhere in the debate. Pay attention to pages that the negative has kicked. Find places where you can cross-apply arguments from them where the block will not have answered that argument. Second, use the negative's arguments against them. Use the negative's arguments against them. There will be lots of arguments that can be cross-applied from one page to the other. There's particularly a lot of interactions between T and theory. So maybe on theory, they've said, don't vote against us unless we've made debate impossible. You can cross-apply that to T and say that it justifies reasonability because you haven't made debate impossible. Second example, sometimes on conditionality, the neg will say that the search for the best policy option justifies conditionality. The search for the idea of the best policy option is also a good justification for intrinsicness. So you can extend intrinsicness and cross-apply their arguments on conditionality for why intrinsicness is good. Third example, unrelated to T and theory, would be conceding the neg's uniqueness arguments and going for uniqueness overwhelms the link. So that's, this puts the negative in a really tough spot because they've spent the whole block trying to win their uniqueness arguments and reading a bunch of cards on that. And you can use that against them by saying, great, these are all reasons, these are all things that the plan doesn't interfere with. And so uniqueness thus overwhelms link. And then if you read additional cards on that, they're suddenly way behind because they have, you know, read a bunch of cards that help your argument and you've read additional evidence that helps your argument. So anywhere that you find an argument can be used against the negative, take that opportunity and, you know, stick it to the negative. If nothing else, that's an example of like a mine that a bomb that you're setting up for the 2NR that they have to deal with, and, you know, hopefully they panic about it. And it does, you know, maybe it's part of your 2AR, maybe it's not, but either way, you suck a lot of time out of the 2NR. Third, and we talked about this a little bit a minute ago, but straight turn something. I think that this is valuable, you know, certainly in the scenario where you think you're in trouble and that you feel overwhelmed, but it's also valuable in the scenario in just a regular 1AR where you're doing okay, but you really want to like ruin the negative's day. Is straight turn something that they don't want to go for. So they extended politics, it's like, fine, it's whatever, but you know they want to go for their critique or they want to go for the other strategy in the block. Straight turn politics really make them unhappy. Fourth, extend a theory argument like conditionality bad. You know, once you've kind of mastered the basics of the 1AR, having a really good, concise, you know, 20 to 30 second extension of conditionality bad can really, really make the negatives day hard because they have to invest time to answer it and it costs time from other stuff. It can also give you an exit strategy for the 2AR. Obviously, that can compromise your ability to use some of these little theory tricks, but it certainly is a valuable skill to develop. I've lost track of where I am number-wise, but make solvency deficit and impact comparison arguments on the case where the negative is less likely to answer them. So we talked about how the status quo will often not be a viable option for the 2NR. If you can make solvency deficit arguments, reasons their counterplan doesn't solve, an impact comparison, like case turns the DA or case outweighs the DA arguments on the case, there's like a great chance that the negative just smooth drops that in the 2NR because they are not paying as much attention to the case as you are. They are paying attention to their counterplan and their disad or their critique or whatever they're going for. So make those arguments, embed those arguments on the case, escalates the likelihood the 2NR drops them. Final idea that I have is a kind of a drill thing rather than a mechanics of the 1AR, but I think it is a really good exercise to redo 1ARs, giving yourself only 4 minutes. So you already think the 1AR is really hard and it's super time pressed. The problem that you're facing probably 9 times out of 10 is that you're not very efficient. If you force yourself to re-give a 1AR in 4 minutes, you will suddenly discover efficiencies that you never thought possible. So give 1ARs and re-give 1ARs in 4 minutes and see, just discover the magic of all the efficiencies that you never thought existed by virtue of forcing yourself to hustle. So that is a drill that I recommend doing for improving your 1AR. Okay, that is the stuff that I had, at least the majority of it. Do people have questions? Charlotte.
You mentioned before about block writing. I've heard people say that the 2A should write the 1AR blocks so that like it sounds more cohesive. I guess what are your thoughts on that to make the 1AR and 2AR match?
That's a good question. I think that it is valuable for the 1A to write the blocks so that they're in your voice, but it should be heavily in combination with the 2A or in cooperation, coordination with the 2A so that the language matches. Like, I think that's a really important consideration. You're absolutely right. But you'll never sound as good reading something that someone else wrote as you will reading something that you wrote, which is why I think it should be the 1A to actually do it. So use the language of the 2AC block and talk to the 2A about how they want to explain it to make sure that the language overlaps. But I think that the 1A should at least have a driving hand in the construction of those blocks. Great question. Any others? Ethan. Are you talking, Ethan? I see that you're unmuted, but I cannot hear you. Can anyone else hear him? Ethan. Maybe put it in the chat. Okay, what do you mean by kicking the F, and why do you have to do that if you want to straight turn DA or impact turn a new impact in the 1AR? Okay, by kicking the F, I mean what it sounds like, not like go to the advantage or the F and be like, we'll concede their solvency arguments. We don't solve, we're not going for the affirmative. So it's like just jettisoning the F as a point of offense for the affirmative. Why do you have to do that if you want to straight turn DA or impact turn a new impact in the 1AR? So you don't have to, strictly speaking. It is not a requirement for straight turning a disad or impact turning something in the block. The reason I kind of used that, mentioned that or talked about it is that it requires a pretty large time investment to get to, impact turning something or straight turning a disad. That usually requires a fair amount of time. And if you're extending the case, that can suck a lot of the time that you want to spend on impact turning or on straight turning. And so, and it's also part of the idea is like, if you're in trouble on the case, which is sometimes part of what's going on, that like they're really kicking the shit out of the AF on whatever. So it is not something you absolutely must do if you're going for offense on a disad, but something to consider to give yourself more time to effectively pull off that strategy. Does that make sense? Cool. Any other questions? I know you have another elective, so I will let you go if not. Mark.
Sorry, could you just explain your second to last tip about like the solvency deficit and like how the case turns to DA? I think my like Zoom lagged out for a second.
Oh, you're good. I just said to make solvency deficits and impact arguments on the case. So like, as you're extending the advantage, you're like, also the counterplane doesn't solve this internal link because XYZ, or, extending your impact and you're like, by the way, this turns the DA or outweighs the DA, and doing it on the case rather than on the counterplane or disad makes it more likely that the 2N drops it.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay, thanks for coming, y'all. Have a good day. See you soon.
Thank you very much.